Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Martin Fischer, and I am very happy to welcome you today to the fourth part of the series Neighbouring Russia, hosted by the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. The series consists of 12 episodes in which we want to look at how Russia's neighbouring countries reacted to the full-scale attack on Ukraine almost exactly 1 year ago. Today, we look at Belarus. Belarus is perceived as a supporter and even co-aggressor in Russia's war against Ukraine. Since the beginning of that war, the Russian army has used Belarus as a deployment area for its attacks on Ukraine. How far will Lukashenka's support go? What does the society think about the war? And how can the Belarusian democratic movement influence the perception of this state in Europe and strengthen the relations with Ukraine? These and other questions will be answered in a few minutes. But first, please, let me welcome our expert from today's event, Ms. Victoria Leukavets. Ms. Leukavets is a researcher at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. She specializes in the domestic and foreign policy of Belarus and other Eastern Partnership countries, as well as elections and electoral protests in non-democratic regimes. The talk will be moderated by my valued colleague Anna Kravtšenko from Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom's Project Director for Ukraine and Belarus, based in Kyiv. Dear Anna, please feel warmly welcomed and thank you for your support. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, and welcome everyone. Welcome to our talk with Victoria Leukavets. Today we're talking about Belarus. And please feel free to also pose your questions to our expert. I will really try to have a look at them, and also we don't have much time, but I think we will still find a way to accommodate your questions as well. And without further ado, I would then start with the very actual question, a very relevant question that's been on the news in the past few days. On Sunday, there was an attack on Russian surveillance plane in Belarus, and the organization BIPOL has taken responsibility for this attack. Victoria, can you maybe tell us what do we know about this attack? Are there any proofs? What are the official statements? And who is actually BIPOL, and how can they destabilize Lukashenko's regime?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this question. It's a pleasure to join this discussion. So according to Alexander Azarov, who is the representative of the BIPOL opposition organization, this drone attack on the Russian plane A-50, which took place near Machulishi airport, was conducted by the Belarusian activists who have already fled the country and are currently in safety. Russian and Belarusian drone attack on the airbase, but blamed it on the Ukrainian military. The satellite images that just to repeat, there was some technical glitch, yes. I imagine. So
yes, Victoria, I thought it was my connection, but it seems like it's your connection.
Oh, wow. So are we online now?
We are online, yes.
Okay. Wonderful. So just to repeat the last sentence, one of the according to the British Ministry of Defense, if these damages to the plane are confirmed substantial, then it would be a significant loss to Russia. And it is believed to be that Russia would only have 6 of these planes left. Speaking about BIPOL, BIPOL is an organization in exile with an office in Poland, which was created by former employees of law enforcement agencies. And their main mission is to counter the Lukashenka regime, to bring justice, to have new elections, and bring democracy to Belarus. Basically, I think it's rather difficult to comment on the extent of the influence inside the country, but the very fact that the Lukashenko regime recognized BIPOL as a terrorist organization signifies that both Lukashenko and his entourage, they are aware of the risks that this organization can pose, and they fear that more and more representatives of security structures can start defecting from the system.
And in the context of war in Ukraine, one question has been discussed for a year now, the possibility of Belarusian active participation in the war, because Lukashenko allows Russia to attack Ukraine from Belarus, from Machulishi field as well. How do you assess the possibility of active participation of Lukashenko's army in hostilities in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I think indeed this question is the one which is on everyone's minds now. And to address this question, it's important to understand that Lukashenko's decision-making is driven by a multi-variable calculus, if you will. So on the one hand, he's very well aware that Belarus participation, direct participation in the war, is highly unpopular among the Belarusians, among the general public. For example, according to Chatham House opinion polls, only 3% of the respondents support direct participation of Belarusian soldiers in the war against Ukraine. For decades, Lukashenko has repeated the same narratives to his electorate, that while he is a president, while he is in power, there will be no war in Belarus. And for a country which throughout its entire history has frequently suffered from many conflicts, this promise proved very persuasive and also helped Lukashenko to ensure his popular legitimacy, stability, and popularity. So if he breaks this promise now, he understands that this can lead to popular dissatisfaction and probably even trigger the Belarusian anti-regime protests. And especially if his security forces are bogged down fighting in Ukraine, they might not be able to maintain order inside Belarus. So he's being very cautious about this move. However, at the same time, over the years, Lukashenko has sacrificed Belarus's sovereignty and independence to Moscow in order to remain in Putin's good graces. His political survival now completely depends on Putin, and if the Kremlin takes the decision to send Belarusian army to the war, Lukashenko might find it difficult to say no. But for the time being, both Putin and Lukashenko seem to be postponing this scenario, and they rather see it as a measure of last resort. Nevertheless, there have been preparations going on for implementing this plan if the necessity arises. As you might know, the military cooperation between Russia and Belarus has increased significantly over the last year. There have been reports of Russian conscripts training on the Belarusian territory. Belarus keeps serving as a launching pad for Russian missile attacks on Ukraine. For example, the military monitoring project, Belarusian Hayun, has reported that there have been over 600 missiles launched at Ukraine from the Belarusian territory. Also, Lukashenko reportedly has started to create his own mercenary group, akin to that in equivalent of Wagner in Russia. So technically, he's preparing, and there is a possibility that Belarusian army might join the war. But once again, it seems to be likely more in the long-term perspective rather than short-term perspective.
Victoria, you just said that Lukashenko actually sacrificed Belarusian sovereignty to Russia. Last week, we also had Belarus on the news, which is actually a rare occasion, that there was a secret paper from Kremlin that kind of foresees the further integration of Belarus into Russia. Do you have any idea how reliable this paper is? Like, is it true? And what's in there? And what do you as expert think what is really possible?
Indeed, this so-called secret plan of Russia's occupation of Belarus, if you will, it has created a lot of media stir. Unfortunately, the contents of it have not been disclosed, have not been public, so we can only rely on some analysis by the experts which exist in the public space. It seems that this document was prepared before the start of the war, and basically, I wouldn't take it as a blueprint, as a guidance which was approved by Putin, by the high elites. It was most likely prepared by the second-tier government officials, and I would take it, you know, maybe with even a share of skepticism. But it's certainly clear. It's certainly clear that Russia has been realizing this scenario over the last 25 years. And in fact, this plan, it doesn't really show anything new. It just confirms, you know, the empirical facts which we have witnessed over the last, as I said, 20-something years of Lukashenko's rule. During this time, economic dependence on Russia has increased significantly. Lukashenko hasn't done anything to diversify the energy and his trade portfolio. So by the time, for example, of the elections in 2020, he was fully economically dependent on Russia. And then in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, when the political crisis started to unfold, and then the war in Ukraine started, this dependence increased further. And I think the area where this dependence is most visible now is the military area. If we look at the 2 previous years, we can see how much Russia has intensified its military cooperation with Belarus. Leading up to the invasion, both Belarus and Russia, they signed a new military doctrine of the Union state, which basically paved the way for Russia to move its military personnel and equipment to Belarus and launch the attack from the Belarusian territory. Then in October last year, Lukashenko announced the creation of the regional group of forces, and it only further stepped up Russia's military presence in Belarus. Both countries continued with military exercises, and last year in December, there were several meetings, high-level meetings, first on the level of ministers of defense, and then also Putin visited Lukashenko. And during all these meetings, it was reiterated that Russia and Belarus will be created the common defense space and increasing their cooperation.
And talking about dependence on Russia, what is the effect of Western sanctions on Belarus and on Russia? Because I've heard some opinions that those sanctions actually even exacerbate Belarus' dependence on Russia, and maybe also on other countries. For example, I guess Lukashenko yesterday, he was in China, also dependence on China.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very interesting question to ask. And yeah, indeed, since the start of the war, to be more precise, following the fraudulent 2020 elections in Belarus, the West started to impose comprehensive sanctions against the Lukashenko regime, targeting not only specific individuals, but also strategic sectors of the Belarusian economy. And as a result of these sanctions, Belarus became even more economically dependent on Russia. If we look at the last year, we can see that it was marked by a slow economic slowdown. The GDP fell on average by 5% annually. The biggest fall was registered in July last year, and it amounted to 10% of the GDP in comparison to the previous year. So, in order to cope with this economic crisis, the Belarusian government has resorted to first increasing taxes inside Belarus, manipulating data in order to disguise the true state of the economy, but also it started to intensify its economic relations with Russia. If we simply look at the trade portfolio of Belarus, it has lost Ukraine as its trade partner. And I would like to remind our audience that Ukraine used to be the third trading partner of Belarus. The official Minsk also lost almost half of its exports to the EU as a result of sanctions. So all of that is now being compensated by stronger economic ties, sort of trade reorientation towards the Russian market.
And how does population react to those? I mean, there is obviously, if the economy decreases, there is obviously also a decrease in quality of life of people. Are there any protests, and are protests possible at all in Belarus now? Are any democratic processes and aspiration possible, or are the repressions just too strong?
Right. When trying to understand what happens in Belarusian society, it's important to note that opinion polling in Belarus is now limited, and the country's domestic politics is largely a black box. So according to the available data, in particular, the opinion polls which are done by the Belarus Initiative at the Chatham House, we can see that a large portion of the Belarusian population has very high anti-war sentiments. Almost 30% consider that Belarus should take a neutral stance in Russia-Ukraine war, and that all the foreign forces should be expelled from the Belarusian territory. But in terms of dissatisfaction with sanctions, there are no visible signs of such moods yet, largely due to the fact that Belarus managed to compensate for these economic losses through this increased cooperation with Russia. However, it's important to note that the demand for democratic change in Belarus has not decreased. People might be fearing going to the street. People might be living in terror of being repressed, of being put into prisons. There are currently more than 1,500 political prisoners in Belarus, and their number continues to grow every day as we speak. So there is fear in the society, but the demand for the democratic changes has not decreased. And when the right moment comes, the population will be able to rise and voice its discontent with what has been happening once again, something that happened after the 2020 elections.
Yes, talking about the elections 2020, the rigged elections, when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya had to leave Belarus, her husband, some of her partners also were imprisoned, and she is now in exile with her transitional cabinet. What is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the, let's say, general democratic Belarusian democratic movement stance on war in Ukraine and in general current affairs in Belarus?
Yes, so Belarusian political opposition, democratic movement in exile is currently grouped around several key persons and several organizations. They are primarily located in Lithuania, in Poland, in the USA. I can mention the following main ones. So the first one is the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, which was established in Lithuania after she was forced to leave Belarus in August 2020. The office initiated the creation of several organs, including the Coordination Council and the Transitional Cabinet. Now, the second major opposition grouping is the National Anti-Crisis Management with the chairman, Pavel Latushko, and they're located in Warsaw. They have rather close cooperation with the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, although at times this cooperation has not been very smooth. In addition, sort of the radical nationalist strand of political opposition is represented by Zenon Pozniak, the legendary figure from the 90s, who was one of the founders of the Belarusian Popular Front and the leader of the Conservative Christian Party, BPF. And recently, Zenon Pozniak has been quite critical of Tikhanovskaya for not being vocal enough on the problems in Belarus and on the war in Ukraine. He has recently paid a visit to Ukraine, met with several officials there, and he's trying to initiate the creation of the so-called Security Council, the military political structure, which will try to bring democratic changes to Belarus. And finally, if we try to sketch the sort of the landscape of Belarusian democratic forces, it's important also to mention the Kalinowski Regiment, which is a military formation within the armed forces of Ukraine, created in March 2022. It consists of the Belarusian volunteers who fight on behalf of Ukraine, and their main motto, their main mission is sort of bring democracy to Belarus by liberating Ukraine. So there are all these different organizations with with their own programs, with their own missions. But I think we can say that they are all united by their stance towards Ukraine, supportive stance. They all express their solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are fighting against the Russian aggression, and they all want to see Belarus free and independent and democratic country. If we look at the activity of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she, for instance, launched the anti-war movement, the idea of which is basically to provide assistance to the Belarusians who are fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Ukraine, to fight this disinformation and propaganda which exists in Belarusian media space, and to prevent the Belarusian regime from helping Russia in its aggression against Ukraine.
Yes, but I work in Ukraine, and I have to say that it is Belarus and Belarusians are considered as co-aggressors now in Ukraine, and it's a very difficult relationship now between Ukraine and Belarus. Do you think that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the democratic movement they somehow can help to reestablish a good relationship between Belarus and Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a very important and crucial question. And it's very true that until now, President Zelensky, he has abstained from any official meetings with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. And so far, two main explanations have been provided for this stance of Ukrainian leadership. So first, the official Kyiv allegedly doesn't want to provoke any unwanted reactions from the Lukashenka regime by meeting Tikhanovskaya. Ukraine still keeps some channels of diplomatic communication with the Lukashenko regime. They have preserved the embassy in Minsk. Igor Kizim, the ambassador, is present there. So they don't want to, so to say, rock the boat by setting up official meetings with Tikhanovskaya. Another explanation which sort of has been given for this position of the Ukrainian leadership is that Tikhanovskaya has not been critical enough of the Kremlin, that she doesn't do or say enough to condemn Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and there have been some, so to say, doubtful people in her entourage. And in this respect, the Ukrainian leadership has perhaps more trust and more belief in the Kalinowski regiment, which I have mentioned previously, and which they see as the real fighters, which have proven, in the field their intention to protect Ukraine, to fight on its behalf against Russia's aggression. But speaking about Ukrainian opinion of Belarusians, I would probably not go so far as to say that all Ukrainians basically unanimously perceive Belarusians as co-aggressors in this war. There are also those who acknowledge and recognize the help of the Belarusian partisan movement, Belarusian volunteers, and also Belarusian democratic forces in supporting Ukraine. In fact, I think in November last year, one of the representatives of Tikhanovskaya's transitional cabinet, Valery Kovalevsky, he had a working meeting in Kyiv with some of the deputies of the Ukrainian parliament. And I would like to point out that in the Ukrainian parliament, there is a sort of faction for democratic Belarus, and some of its members, they understand the importance of cooperating with the Belarusian democratic forces. So it's certainly very, very important to underline this difference between the Lukashenko regime and the Belarusian people. And so far, it has been one of the key messages of Svetlana's anti-war campaign. And she keeps emphasizing this message during each of her official visits. This has already brought some positive results. For example, Czech government, they have made a special exception for Belarusian students and provided scholarships and recognized that it's crucial to make this differentiation between ordinary Belarusians and the accomplices of the Lukashenko regime.
Yes, and unfortunately, Victoria, I think we need another hour to discuss all questions. Unfortunately, we have to end our talk now. And before we end, I just want to thank you, Victoria, very much for your expertise. And I want to thank all the audience. And I want to remind that it's a series of talks. And next week, we are talking about Moldova. If you liked our talk today, please register and join us next week in our talk about Moldova and how has it changed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung for organizing this.